Good morning, everybody. As people are logging on, feel free to say hello, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Nice to see some familiar names. Morning, Ted and Brenda and Mario. We'll just give it a few minutes as people are logging on. Hi, Dan. Hey, Melissa. Nice to see your name. Good morning, James and Florin and Carrie. We'll just give it 2 minutes, and then I will get started with week 6 of our series. And please note that if you weren't able to attend all of the other sessions, that this is still a helpful presentation because the information can be used standalone or on top of all the other information you've received prior to now. Good morning, Moose Jaw. Hey, Lisa. Good morning, Cindy. Just going to give it 1 more minute. Good What I'll probably do is we're just waiting for a few people to log on. Everybody knows that this is about forgiveness today and maintaining positive change as we round out the last of our 6 series on managing anger. I'm just going to advance to the next slide, and I'll give you an opportunity to read that as we are waiting for people to join us. You've seen this before, but this is a mandatory slide for us, so please take a second to read through those points. All right. Okay, as mentioned, today is week 6 of the Managing Anger Through Forgiveness and Maintaining Positive Change. So 2 different topics. Typically, if you were to take this course as a whole, it would be called Managing Angry Moments. And depending on the base that you're at, sometimes it is offered in 2 days, full day, half days. But as you know, we've been going through the modules week to week over 6 weeks. I will be sharing with you a bunch of handouts towards the end. And you know that if you have been on this before, we do have some polls that we have to get through. So I'm going to, without further ado, start the session. So hope everybody has had an opportunity to read that slide that's in front of you. Webinars being recorded will be available for viewing on CAF Connection at a later date, as will all the presentations that you see National put out. And then I think the most important part is the piece about people's stories are theirs alone to tell. There'll be a couple of opportunities where I ask if people are interested or willing to share an example. So if, say, you're talking with a friend afterwards that you were part of this session, please just respect the fact that people have their own stories and observe confidentiality. All right, welcome, Cappy. Okay, so next slide is that mandatory poll, and I'm just going to share it in 1 second here. Should be up in right now. So please, if you would take a moment to just answer your affiliation with the CAF community. Perfect. Thank you. Just so you know, we're about half and half CAF members and half either family or D&D or CFMWS employees. A couple of other just logistics. The chat is available for you at any time, whether or not we're doing a discussion or whether or not you may have a question. So please feel free to use that. If I can't get to the question right away, I will get to it. But I also have my colleagues on with me as well today. So depending on what your query may be, you may actually get an answer from one of the team members from Health Promotion Trenton. Okay, here we go. So the objectives for this morning, we're going to talk about some myths about forgiveness. We're going to talk about the benefits of forgiving, learn all about grudges, explain the forgiveness process. We're going to describe lapse and relapse and those situations that can lead to it, how to avoid it, and then certainly take a look at some personal strengths, an opportunity to reflect on maybe some of the skills that you've achieved over the 6 weeks and how you may implement those moving forward. Okay, so everybody's probably seen this before, but the thinking skills model is back up because now we're introducing this concept of forgiveness. We've talked for 5 weeks about anger, and we've talked about how to work through difficult conversations. We've talked about the pros and cons of anger, and we've talked about what that in fact does to your ultimate behavior depending on a situation that you may be in. Now that we're talking about forgiveness, we're going to apply that into this thinking skills model, and we're going to recognize that if you do choose to forgive, and we're going to talk about some situations where forgiveness may not be an option, But if you do choose to use forgiveness as a tool, then that too is going to guide number 5, your behavior. So a situation may take place. You're going to have thoughts, physical sensations, emotions. Your behavior can also be positively impacted by this concept of forgiveness that we're going to explore this morning. Morning, Krista. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is a couple of discussion questions, and we're just going to do one at a time. And please feel free to use the chat. We want to make this as interactive as possible. I certainly wish it was more interactive, then I could see all of you and you just didn't have to see just me. But your participation through the chat would be awesome. So first question is, what sorts of things did we learn from others about forgiveness? Maybe as we were growing up, maybe at home, maybe at school, maybe part of a religious or spiritual education. What are some examples of things that maybe you've heard, thought, been led or taught that you've applied, or maybe not applied, but something that, okay, thank you, Mario, reduces future confrontations? Absolutely. So forgiveness is going to reduce some future confrontation. Anything else that people learned from school? Can you think of a playground lesson? Yep, sorry goes a long way. That most situations do require forgiveness. Yes, Cappy. Yep. So great examples. I certainly remember in the schoolyard, the teacher saying, you need to forgive your friend for what they've just done. Ted has offered that, yes, it puts an end to a situation. Absolutely. It can close a situation that may have been difficult, frustrating, and disappointing. And yes, Dan, thank you. Letting things go, for sure. So what are some of the advantages? What are some of the pluses to forgiving? It's the second question. Yes, forgive and forget, or is that just a saying? We're going to talk about that because that is a great concept, that forgiving doesn't mean we have to forget. But we've often heard that term. So what are some advantages of forgiving? Closure, for sure. You won't be bitter in the long term. Yeah. A sense of relief, so no grudges. Good. Florin mentioned mental health. Absolutely. What a stress relief. If you could put something to rest, makes us feel better, for sure. Easier on your mind. You don't carry the burden. And the benefits of forgiving are personal. It's for you. Yeah, good point, Krista. You begin to trust yourself. Absolutely. These are textbook answers. So the good news is there's a lot of positives to forgiving. What might some of the disadvantages of forgiving be? Yes, for sure. People tend to take advantage of you by simply saying sorry every time, and they do the exact same thing. So then there's been no learning occurring, no change implemented. Absolutely. Sometimes the disadvantage is it justifies a bad behavior, and things could be going in circles, and they may not, in fact, forgive you. Yep, you could give power to the other person. Good point, Ted. And the disadvantages of forgiving, you may not stand up for yourself. So that's all great stuff there. That's exactly what we're looking for when we think about how we can use these concepts and terms in our everyday life. And so much of what we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks, so much of it is obviously applicable to the workplace, but you're also going to find benefit from it in your personal life. So hopefully these concepts of forgiveness are things that you can apply in daily life, wherever that may be. Okay, thank you for participating in those questions. So this next slide is just giving us, and I've given you a handout with a few more, and these included, and you'll get that towards the end because I haven't shared that yet, but it's coming. Some quotes on forgiveness. I'm going to jump right to the very last one because that one resonates with me. Forgiveness is giving up hope for a better past. So, what an interesting concept. We can't really change the past, and giving up hope is this whole entwined with this whole forgiveness concept. Then the first one, forgiveness is giving up the resentment to which you're entitled, offering to the person or persons who hurt you friendlier attitudes to which they may not be entitled. And at the heart of forgiveness is a change of our attitude and feelings from anger, resentment, and condemnation to a new willingness to put aside all negative feelings, thoughts, and all rightful claims. It is a unilateral decision to abandon grudges and to let go the desire to get even. So, just some food for thought. And we're going to start to reflect on maybe situations you've been in where forgiveness was absolutely the positives, the advantages, and then other situations where maybe forgiveness, like I think Krista said, is really for you. It's not so much for the other person. And what does that mean for the outcome of the relationship? So this next slide reminds us of a definition from the Oxford Online Dictionary. So what does forgiveness mean? It is defined as the following: to cease resenting and wanting to punish an offense, flaw, or mistake. So you can probably think of a situation where you've just stopped trying to even a score or make something better, or stop punishing a person for a disagreement that you may have had, or an unfortunate exchange that took place, or something that they personally did to you. This definition, although very simple, is just about stopping the resentment and stopping to want to punish an offense, a flaw, or mistake. And I think the key word there is the mistake. In some cases, people truly did make a mistake, depending on the example that you may be thinking of. It could be a situation where somebody has had to apologize to you, and it truly was an error, maybe an error in judgment, or maybe just an error. They made a mistake, they didn't know better. And we talked a lot about that with our thinking errors. Brenda has asked, at times, is forgiveness allowing the other person to be imperfect, to reflect upon or change our expectation of that person? Forgiveness is a lot of things, and we're going to examine that for sure. A couple of definitions. Resentment, the opposite of forgiveness. Anger and ill will in view of a real or imagined wrong. So we're wanting to look at some of those positives that people brought up: the mental health positive, the stress management positive, the closure. And when we live in a world of resentment, which, as you can see by the slide, is the opposite of forgiveness, anger and ill will in view of real or imagined wrong. So that resentment is going to carry along with us. We're gonna bring that along like extra luggage wherever we go. And we're going to start to recognize, as you already have, the negatives of not forgiving, or the negatives, the disadvantages or advantages of forgiving, depending on how you look at it. But resentment is really going to potentially impact our mental health, our stress. So this next slide reminds us that when we're thinking and reflecting on situations that may have been infused with anger, a difficult exchange, a conversation that didn't go well, an apology that absolutely is required, we define those incidences or those situations and circumstances in two categories. And I think we need to be mindful in how different these can be. So the shallow hurts, by definition, are things that are irritations or disappointments, maybe unmet expectations. But there definitely are also deep hurts, the disloyalty, the broken promises, the lack of support, the broken trust, or the betrayal. So when we're talking this morning and we're offering up examples, we will see probably or feel or remember examples all through a wide range of degrees, and recognizing that the shallow and the deep is important for us to acknowledge. There will be absolutely examples you think of that are deep hurts, that are extremely impactful, and that forgiveness may not be something you're prepared to deal with just yet, and or it's not going to be as simple as some of those shallow hurts, like those irritations where somebody may have said something, in the coffee on the coffee break or in the lunchroom, or a family member may have said something that truly disappointed you and uh, upset you, but that in fact you choose to maybe just let go of it, as opposed to needing to forgive or to align your thoughts on how that's going to guide your behavior. So somebody, in fact, used the word grudge already, which is great. When we hold on to grudges, so when we choose to carry that extra baggage of anger around with us towards a person or a situation, we can also define or look at that as a bit of a grudge. We bring bitterness and anger into relationships. It takes away the enjoyment of the present. When we hold on to grudges, we could feel depressed or anxious. We could lose valuable and enriching connections with others. And these are all things to consider about the disadvantages to holding a grudge. So we're going to look at the benefits. We talked about the advantages, but we are going to now get right into what these benefits are. So a forgiving situation, when applicable, will enhance a healthier relationship. You will have a greater psychological well-being. The slide reads, you'll have less stress and hostility. So if you were carrying anger and a grudge into a situation that's totally different from what caused your feelings, emotions, behaviors, then in fact, you're going to impact hostile situations regardless of what they are. They may not even be with that person that you have been in exchange or disagreement with. So recognizing how the benefits of forgiving can impact all of your interactions. Lower blood pressure. So we're going to talk about the health of it. That anger as an emotion, when we are able to manage it, and in fact, if we choose not to use forgiveness or we don't close it off, the situation that has occurred, it can have a health impact. So really important for us to recognize that. Fewer symptoms of depression, anxiety, and chronic pain. So more benefits to the forgiveness piece. And then a lower risk of alcohol and substance abuse. What we know about substance misuse is there are lots of reasons why people use, but one of them is to forget or to escape or to relieve pain. So if we aren't able to move through a painful situation, we may look to resources such as substances to appease the issue or the concern. Okay, so this next slide. This is important, and I'm sorry I don't have the active chat from up above handy because I'm trying to manage a couple screens here. But somebody did say, "Forgive and forget." Isn't that what we were taught? It may have been Cappy. And yeah, we were told or taught, encouraged to forgive a situation, forget it, and move on. This slide reminds us that forgiving is the same. So the myth, sorry, back it up. 5 myths, forgiving is the same as forgetting. That's a myth. Forgiving is about you. Krista mentioned that this is about you, not the other person. And in fact, it is not the same as forgetting. Forgiving is the same as excusing. That's a myth. Forgiving is the same as reconciling. A myth. Forgiving makes you weak. And just if we hang on that point for a minute, we would in fact argue that forgiveness is about resilience and being able to bounce back in the face of adversity and carry on, which is a sign of strength. And then the last one is forgiving depends on the other person acknowledging the wrongful behavior. So those are 5 really important myths. The last one, forgiving depends on the other person acknowledging the wrongful behavior. If the forgiveness really doesn't have to be this interaction between 2 people where both people are compliant with this agreement that we're going to forgive and move on, there might be a situation where you choose to forgive a person without them even knowing it. We have a colleague in the field that talked about forgiveness absolutely was for her in a situation that was about a deep hurt, a very disloyal, impactful situation growing up with her father. And the forgiveness piece happened at the cemetery. He was long past when she made the decision to, in fact, forgive him. So the important piece here is that the other person doesn't have to engage entirely in the situation, that we need to recognize the benefit, and the practice is for you. And sorry, wouldn't that be more letting go? Jeremy, can you just clarify what your question is? What's that? I'll just let the chat refresh. And sorry, I'm trying to keep up to the chat and the slides at the same time. Florin mentioned it doesn't, you're right, it depends on the intelligence of the other person. Mario mentioned it doesn't always work out. Absolutely, it may not always work out. Okay, I'm going to carry on. So what it is, it involves that one person. It's an act of will to enter into a process. It's a choice. If forgiveness is a peace of mind, it means we'll be less emotionally reactive in relation to someone who has hurt us. So those are some great statements of what forgiveness is. It's absolutely a choice. So to Mario's point, it doesn't always work out. Sometimes it may not work out because you choose not to forgive, or the situation doesn't reflect that. Okay, so Jeremy mentioned if you can't interact with the person, there is no reconciliation. So I think it's less forgiving a person. You just let go of the anger and move forward. Absolutely. So sometimes, yeah, you're right. It's not, in fact, forgiveness. It's more of this concept of letting go. So back to what forgiveness is. This slide is important because it can define or give you an idea on whether or not forgiveness is something you're going to explore. So in fact, you're in a situation that's very uncomfortable. Maybe it's with a family member, and maybe they are not collaborative in a difficult conversation. Maybe they don't want to have that conversation. Maybe they've stopped speaking with you. Well, you can forgive them for their, if you choose to, you can forgive them for their actions. It's a choice to do so, and it really will be about you. It'll also probably, as the slide indicates, help you be less emotional in all of your situations. So we're building a bit of a theory here for how important or impactful or poignant forgiveness can be. But please, let's recognize the caveat that there will be circumstances, depending on whether it's a shallow or a deep hurt that we're talking about, where forgiveness doesn't have to be the answer. We're recognizing the benefits when applicable. So there's a process for forgiving others. You decide or you declare your intention to forgive. or to stop seeking revenge, to stop allowing that bitterness. You recognize your hurt and your anger. You allow yourself to feel it, to acknowledge it, that definitely a wrong was committed. You acknowledge that your needs and expectations were not met, and you choose to either end or renew the relationship. So decide, recognize, acknowledge, choose. In the previous weeks, we talked a lot about difficult conversations, and we talked about trigger thoughts and coping thoughts, and we used the death script. And let's say we've had an altercation or an unfortunate situation with a colleague or a family member, and now we are examining what the process can look like. Does anybody have, and for the sake of this not being as interactive as we'd like, does anybody have an easy example that we could examine of forgiveness and how that worked out? And if we could make it more of a shallow rather than a really deep hurt, just because we're not in a classroom together and the lack of real interaction makes it difficult just to see how everybody is dealing with the concepts. So does anybody have an example of where there was a situation where you had to forgive somebody and whether or not that resulted in things being better? You maintained the rapport, maintained the relationship, and or did you choose just to let that relationship go to the way? Anybody have an example? It can be very easy. It could be somebody, it could be somebody in the Tim Hortons lineup and that you chose to, so very shallow, not deep. I'm trying to keep it fairly light and simple for the purpose of this platform. Very good. Thank you. Whew, I'm so glad we have an example to discuss where a breakup occurred and both parties messed up for everyone. Okay, so Cappy's example is about, I think it's about forgiving when a breakup occurs and then you, in fact, decide to part ways and you forgive that the relationship didn't work. Brenda Riddell wrote in getting cut off while driving to work. So you choose to, thank you, Cappy, for the clarification. I didn't want to put words in your mouth. Getting cut off at work, you say to yourself, you use your coping thoughts and you say, they must be in more of a rush than I am. I'm going to let it go. Resentment or grudge might be taking down the license plate, getting in touch with the local authorities and saying this person is a horrible driver. And in some cases, obviously that might have to happen. But if it's truly just somebody cutting in, then you may choose just to say, I'm not going to worry about this. I'm over it. I'm going to let it go. Arguments with a friend and reconciling after. Yeah, great example, Dan. You have an argument with a friend and you decide to work through it. It's going to be a difficult conversation for sure, but you choose to reconcile for the sake of the relationship. Mario's example is dealing with arrogant people at work. So the process for forgiving others is we decide and we recognize that they're upsetting us, but maybe in fact they're arrogant. It's a personality setback for them. You acknowledge the situation and then you choose to decide how you're going to move forward with that situation and whether or not you're going to be able to continue to work through a comfortable situation without confronting them, maintain the relationship, obviously, because you work together, but the recognizing piece will be really important as you work through the process. And unfortunately, we all have to deal with arrogant people in our lives, whether that's at work or in our community or in our network. But absolutely making sure that we don't feel taken advantage of and we are not, by these arrogant people, treated as a doormat. We now have a sort of communication skills in our toolbox, knowing when we don't choose to be feeling like we're being taken advantage of. And sorry, Brenda just mentioned using our assertive, yeah. Okay. So the process of self-forgiveness. So we've been talking about forgiving others. This slide talks about forgiving ourselves. So really important to recognize that there'll be situations where, you may have erred. You may have said or done something. You may have contributed to a situation. And that might be resentment and grudge and baggage that you're carrying around. So it's going to be really important that you recognize that forgiveness is not always just about forgiving someone else. It is, in fact, about forgiving yourself, too. Decide or declare your intention to forgive yourself. Acknowledge that, yeah, absolutely, you may have hurt somebody else. Choose to consciously let go of your guilt, because we know the advantages of forgiveness, and we talk about our mental health and our physical health, like the blood pressure concept and managing our stress and anxiety and depression, all of those things as contributing factors. If we choose to forgive ourselves, the advantages are profound. And then the last one is remind yourself that you've made a choice to forgive yourself when the feelings of guilt or regret resurface. Really important. And again, depending on what we're talking about, a shallow or a deep hurt, recognizing the varying degrees of the examples that you might be thinking of right now, but that forgiving yourself is an important concept for consideration. Cappy mentioned, yes, then the issue with dealing with the coworker and resolving thing one-on-one can be good, but also can turn against you if someone hears about it like the boss, and then the boss feels that, yeah, absolutely. So back to Brenda's point, our assertive communication skills, and are reminded that assertive means respectful, and hopefully it doesn't end up becoming more of a situation, because it ends up being a conversation that, although might be difficult, if we're using the right skills, it can be like any other conversation with a positive outcome, hopefully. Yeah, good point, though. Other people interfering to a situation or a process can absolutely cause the situation to have more energy. And we want to dismiss some of that energy so that we can work through the situation positively. So, self-forgiveness. Does anybody have an example of something that you had to forgive yourself for? And as you're thinking of what you may choose to say, I'll sacrifice myself in it, please feel free to add to the chat. Years ago, just totally out of ignorance, I made a comment once about another religion, and I truly didn't know. I had absolutely no idea. And I, in fact, offended somebody. And for a long time, I sort of beat myself up and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. Why would I have thought that? And then I recognized that it was based on my experience, on my ignorance, on many different things. And I really did have to, because it would pop into my mind, I did have to go through this process of self-forgiveness. And the fact that I'm recalling it is a good thing, because now I can recall it without feeling total angst that I did feel at the time. And it was probably 20 plus years ago. Okay, Dan offered up your own limitations. So you forgive yourself for your own limitation. Absolutely. My mother said to me the other night, she said, I know I'm horrible with technology. That's just a thing. I've accepted that that's a limitation. I'm going to also justify it by my age, but I have forgiven myself. So there would be a very shallow hurt. But I've forgiven myself because I come by it honestly, and I fit that bracket of, and there's a stereotype, hers, not mine, that older people do at times struggle with technology. So her example was, I'm forgiving myself because I know that I am limited in my skill set with regards to tech. And this was me trying to help her get on a Zoom with all of her distant relatives. So she, although that's an easy, fun one, she did say, I get so frustrated with myself, and then I have to just say, give yourself a break, forgive yourself. You're going to continue to work on this skill, but you're really bad at it right now. Okay, James offered disappointing your children with missing. There's a good one. Yeah, absolutely. And by good, I mean a good example, because you're in good company, because it happens to all of us that we miss an event, and our children become disappointed by that. So absolutely, the process of that self-forgiveness, you decide, you acknowledge, you choose to let go of that guilt. And the beauty of this is that it can also guide you into the next situation and prepare for how that could be an anger emotional situation if in fact you feel that you've disappointed or might disappoint them again. So there's a quote in sport, nothing is learned in a win, and you only learn things in a loss. So often we're reminded in day-to-day activities when things don't go so well, we learn a lot, and that can be carried forward, hopefully, the next time there's an event that we have to attend or get to or not forget, or whatever the situation might be, conflict with work or various different reasons. Okay, so key concepts when we look at forgiveness. Yeah, that's good, Kathy. I like that one. That's a nice, easy one. Same with skipping playtime with the cat. They'll let you know. Yep, for sure. And will the cat forgive you? Nope, they might not. They're gonna demand your attention, and they'll get it however they can. So, key concepts to reflect upon. Forgiveness is first and foremost for you. Hopefully, that's a takeaway. Forgiveness is a decision and a process. Forgiving benefits your physical and your mental fitness, and it does help manage our anger. So, again, think back to that thinking skills model. An event takes place, and we go through this little flow chart, which then ultimately guides our behavior. If we can get some control over our emotions and our thoughts, and ultimately maybe insert forgiveness in there, that's going to help the behavior. Okay, the next part of the session is about maintaining positive change with a lot of the skills that we've discussed. So we're going to talk about lapse and relapse. So we may have been working really hard on a difficult conversation. Maybe we're starting to use our desk script at home. We're using it at work. Our trigger thoughts and our thinking errors are things that we're totally hyper aware of now. But then all of a sudden a situation takes place, and you didn't get the anger emotion in check like you thought you should have, could have, would have. And in fact, we would look at that as a lapse. So like anything, if tomorrow you were to start a new workout regime and you decided you were going to work out 4 days a week for the next 4 weeks and see how that went, and on week 3 you only did 2, we would call that a little lapse in what your plan was. So similar to other plans that people have, this emotional skill is also something that could lapse. So a short-term single event, a relapse, longer-term multiple events that you maybe go back to the way that you were behaving to a situation more often than you would like, and we would think that is a relapse. So everyone is going to lapse, but not everyone will relapse. So for that person going to the gym, week 3, they got to the gym twice. That wasn't part of the plan, but there's week 4 and they can get back on track, and now it's truly just a lapse. If week 3 was the be all and end all and they are never ever working out again, well, we would call that a relapse. So similar to this emotional skill that we're trying to work through, we could have lapses and relapses. Whoops. Oh, sorry. I double clicked. So what in fact can contribute to having a lapse? So that might be a typo. Sorry about that. This slide reminds us that, let's say all of a sudden you have some extra life stressors. They could be positive or negative, but there's an increase of them. Well, that can contribute to a lapse or relapse. The stress of change. You could have a move coming up. You could have a new baby on the way. You could have a new workmate. All of those things can contribute to a lapse or relapse. And then, in fact, the slide also reminds us that other things that could contribute is to how you are with coping to difficult situations. And are you capable of dealing with a difficult situation before, during, and after? So your own coping could contribute to this concept of lapse relapse. So this next slide, we're going to go through the various before, during, and after difficult conversations and situations. So in the last 6 series, we've talked a lot about difficult conversations or situations that could escalate an anger response. And then, of course, we've looked at all the skills associated with that to try to dissipate a negative situation. Now we're going to take a look that knowing difficult conversations and situations are probably imminent. We probably all will have them in our day-to-day, maybe not daily, but certainly week to week, month to month, we're going to encounter this. So this is about a skill of coping before a difficult conversation. So, for example, let's say you have to discipline a subordinate, and you know that you have to call them in, you have to have that conversation. You know that that's going to be a difficult conversation, and these are the things that potentially you would say to yourself prior to. So you're going to recognize that it could generate anger. You need to be realistic about your strengths and weaknesses and know your triggers and your limits. Be aware of how you may trigger somebody else, and those would be a great start for the coping skills when you know you are going into a difficult conversation. Does anybody have an example of what they would say to themselves before going into a difficult conversation, whether it be work related or family related? Maybe your neighbor. You got a neighbor that, maybe you don't always see eye to eye with, and you have to have a conversation with them about the fence or the repairs of the fence. Anybody have an example of some of the things they may have said to themselves leading into a difficult conversation? Good one, Joe. You remind yourself that you're strong. Cindy uses the word breathe. Yep, good. It's going to work. This is going to work. Ted reminds himself that this is the power of positive thinking. Great answers. Thank you. So the next slide is about coping before. Whoops. Yes. Hang on. Yeah. The next slide is entitled Coping Before Difficult Conversations. Sorry, just let me. There we go. I think I got it right. And this slide reminds us, again, a continuation of the last one, that our self-care will be really important, that we need to look after ourselves. We're going to want to establish goals, understand what you want to accomplish going into a difficult conversation. Write down your plan. This might be where you use that desk script. You explain, you describe. The example I often use for the desk script is I ask my child to do the dishwasher, and I started off by saying, it would be really helpful and make me so happy if you help out with emptying the dishwasher. You'd be really contributing to the chores of the household. Is that something you're able to do? And could you get it done by, 5 o'clock? Now, there's a very simple example, and some people would say, just tell your child to do the dishwasher. But recognizing that having a plan on how you're going to say something, even as simple as it is, can actually minimize the potential for an emotional exchange. And teenagers sometimes can bring to a conversation emotion prior to the request of emptying a dishwasher. Okay, so coping before difficult conversations. There are just 3 more examples of things that you can consider. During the difficult conversation, and this might be easier said than done, but again, prior to reminding yourself on what this looks like, you're going to want to manage those trigger thoughts. Be aware of what some of your trigger thoughts are. You're going to want to use your coping thoughts. What are, Cindy gave us an example, Joe gave us an example, strength and breath. Really important to have those skills handy. Use a timeout skill if necessary. Choose that prior to you have all of these things in your pocket. Know when you could employ that, and you could say, I think in the interest of this being a really great conversation, we should probably take a 5-minute timeout. Do you agree? Or it could be an hour timeout. The timeout is up to you. Use good listening skills, and we talked about that over the last 6 weeks. And use your assertive communication skills. So big difference between aggressive and assertive. Assertive is achieving what you want out of a situation by respecting both parties. Aggressive is achieving what you want out of a situation with no respect. So we want to use our assertive communication skills. Yes, Mario, good point. Try to picture yourself in the other person's shoes. Another thing to prepare with thought for going into a difficult conversation. Okay, this next slide is coping after a difficult conversation. You can probably think of right now, and I hate to make you think of it because recalling unfortunate conversations are never the most healthy thing to do. But you can probably think of a situation where you were in a circumstance that didn't go well, and what was necessary afterwards so that you can move away from it, move on from it, learn from it, and achieve success the next time, or just recognize what that was. This slide reminds us that you absolutely can benefit from taking time to relax and managing your stress. Recognize what went well and what did not. In the CAF, we're great at after-action reports. We always analyze an event, an exercise, a skill, a duty, a task, a procedure, and we always look at it by saying what worked, what didn't work well. And that after action report is a guidance for the next person. So recognizing that that's a skill we use all the time, but we can actually apply it to our difficult conversations. Keep focused on the problem, not the people. So often, you'll be talking about a situation that occurred in the workplace and you keep referring to that person. It's really important that we try to recognize that we want to put our emphasis on the problem. Be forgiving of yourself and others. If it didn't go well, recognize that it may not have had the ability to go well because of a whole bunch of extenuating circumstances. So be forgiving of yourself and of others after a difficult conversation. Try not to dwell on the issue. Give yourself a mental break from the situation. So dwelling on the situation again is much like this concept of the grudge and the extra baggage that we choose to carry with us. We want to give ourselves a break. So some key concepts on lapse, relapse. Absolutely, there will be situations that can lead to a relapse, but we do know that there's success when we work to manage our stress and we apply positive coping techniques. Does anybody have I just saw another comment in the chat, so before I get on my thought, I'll read that. Sometimes recognizing that the person you had the difficult conversation with was never open to, yeah, that's a great point. So then it ends up being kind of a brick wall you're talking to, that they weren't as agreeable to the difficult conversation. So now the success is very difficult to find because you don't have a willing second party. Yeah, that one is difficult, and that might take more preparation and buy-in from the other person. They need to have the same engagement in it working out well that you do, or a similar engagement. Otherwise, yes, that is actually going to contribute to the stress and emotion associated with a difficult conversation. Oh yes, I was going to ask if anybody can recalls maybe it was a difficult day, a stressful concept. Maybe you got an email that announced some new initiative and it really threw you off. You had a tough day at work. What does that look like? If we know after a difficult conversation, we should work through the self-care piece. What are some of the skills or tools that people are using after a difficult conversation, or after a tough work day, or a tough telework day, whatever that might look like? Anybody have an example? Crystal, yeah, being called back to work and deciding if I should. Hang with the dog, absolutely. Tough day. Um, find some time. Pet therapy is huge. Try to focus, walk around for a bit. Yeah, go to the gym. Absolutely. Work out. Look at that. Boom, boom. Both, two people. Three. A lot of people use their physical fitness for their mental health, and that's a good thing. So, really important that we do have some tools in our toolbox for recognizing that not all days are going to be great. Not all conversations are going to be great. But one thing that could be a constant is the skills that you have in place to get you past or through that. And recognizing that there's lots of them, and everybody has given some great examples, but knowing that is going to help the situation. So, just a couple of summarizing points for the series over the last 6 weeks. I know there was a lot of information. We talked about anger as an emotion when a stressful situation occurs. We talked about the link between stress and anger and the mental fitness connection to all of that. Trigger thoughts and coping thoughts. We looked at those 10 thinking errors, that all or nothing, that shoulding and musting, that generalizing, the black and white concept, all of those things that contribute to a situation not being as positive as it could be, or eliciting the anger piece. We looked at assertive communication, how important that is, and with that, our listening skills. We this week talked about forgiveness and how there will be situations where forgiveness is extremely beneficial. We also know that there might be examples that you have where forgiveness or the relationship is not even something that you need to maintain. So um, although we are proponents of the concept of forgiveness, we do recognize that it isn't 100% applicable. And then the last piece that we looked at was the lapse and relapse prevention. What I want to do is just share the handouts. So I'll do that, but I do have a couple other polls, and I would love to hear any questions, comments, or concerns before we finish up. You will see that I've loaded in the forgiveness handout and the lapse relapse coping handout. I'm going to jump back to chat for a second. Are there any questions before we do those last couple of polls? Any overarching concerns, queries, anything that anybody would like further clarification on any of the 6 weeks? Because I do have My colleagues on the line as well. Cindy's here, as is Brenda. Okay, so I'm going to share the next poll. And it is about the application of what you learned today in daily living. If you wouldn't mind answering that poll. And then I'm going to thank you for participating in that. I'm going to share one last poll, and that's about the Demio platform, and then I will jump back to the chat. Okay, and then the next poll is about the Demio platform. Whoops. Which I've made a boo-boo about here. Hang on a second. I'll be okay. There we go. And thank you for your participation. Thank you for sharing your examples in the chat room. There will be a time when we get to be face-to-face, but until such time, this Demio platform has worked well for the application of the programs that we're doing. And we recognize that there may be some shortfalls with any web-based platform, but as you know, National's worked hard to make sure that we're delivering through a means that is suitable for the constraints that we are faced with. So thank you. Jumping back to chat, any parting questions? As I say, thank you for your participation over the last 6 weeks. We are involved with the national series, and next week we are starting a lifestyle series on Mondays at 11. There will be lots of promotion on that in the next days, but also looking to CAF Connection to the Health Promotion Webinar tab for all that is available to you. But certainly we are starting with a different concept on Monday. And if there's nothing else, I think I will move to end the session, and hopefully everybody is able to access those handouts. Please note that you can always reach out to us at the following email. And thank you again for your participation.